The winter wind came down Obsidian Ridge like a blade dragged over bone. It cut through Main Street, past the shuttered mercantile, past the blacksmith's cold forge, and straight into the muddy stretch before Mercer Bank, where Clara Vance lay on her hands and knees with brown water soaking through her skirt. Her palms sank deep. The mud was half frozen on top and rotten underneath. It smelled of horse piss, coal smoke, and old blood from the butcher's drain. Above her, Silas Mercer stood clean as a Sunday preacher. His black coat had brass buttons. His boots shone hard. One of those boots rested on Clara's leather satchel, pinning it flat in the muck. "Now look here," Silas said, holding up a wet sheet of paper between two gloved fingers. "The dead man's girl has brought me treasure." Men laughed from the boardwalk. Not loud at first, just enough. A cough, a snort, a woman's hand over her mouth. Clara pushed herself up, but her fingers slipped. Mud climbed under her nails. Her bonnet hung loose, one ribbon torn clean away. A strand of dark hair stuck to her cheek and froze there. "That is my uncle's hand," she said. Silas looked at the paper. Then he turned it so the crowd could see the broken seal. "Your uncle's hand is in the grave." He dropped the paper. It landed beside her knee. Before Clara could reach for it, Silas ground his heel down. The page twisted under his boot. Ink bled into the mud. Something small moved in Clara's throat, but no sound came. She looked at the bank door, at the windows, at the women she had bought flour from, at the men who had tipped hats to her uncle when his back was straight and his purse was full. No one stepped down. No one even looked at her long. Silas bent close. His breath carried tobacco and wintergreen. "You came into my town with dirt claims, water claims, dead men's lies, and a name that buys nothing." He flicked another paper into the street. "You are owed nothing. My uncle owned shares in this bank." Silas smiled with only one side of his mouth. "Your uncle died owing me. That is false." His hand struck fast. Not hard enough to break skin. Hard enough to turn every face silent. Clara's cheek snapped sideways. Her teeth clicked. For one thin second, all she could hear was the ringing in her skull and the wet drip from the bank awning. Silas straightened. "Pick up your trash and crawl back east." Clara reached for the scattered papers. A boy near the hitching rail set his boot on one. His father did not stop him. Another sheet slid in the wind, caught against a wagon wheel, and folded into slush. Clara gathered what she could with shaking fingers. The cold had turned her knuckles white and stiff. Silas lifted her satchel by its strap. Then he tossed it. It struck her shoulder and spilled open. A brass key, 2 ledgers, a sewing roll, and a tintype of a gray-bearded man hit the mud. The tintype landed face down. Clara stared at it. Her mouth opened once, shut. Then she pressed both hands flat in the black slop and spoke so low the front row had to lean in. "I have no family left." The wind took the words down the street. Nobody laughed now. A mule stamped once. Somewhere behind the crowd, spurs rang against frozen boards. Slow, heavy. The crowd parted before anyone turned to see why. A man came through them like a wall walking. He wore a wolf hide over his shoulders, stiff with snow. His beard was dark and wild. One side of his face had been cut from temple to jaw and healed wrong. His hands hung low bare, scarred and wide enough to cover a child's skull. Gideon Thorne. The name moved without speech. Shoulders drew in. A woman pulled her little girl back by the collar. The boy at the wagon wheel took his foot off Clara's paper. Gideon stopped beside her. He did not look at the crowd. He crouched slow for a man his size and picked up the tintype. He wiped mud from the old man's face with his thumb, careful as if touching a wound. Then he gathered the papers, one by one. Silas's smile thinned. "You got no business here, Thorne." Gideon put the papers inside the satchel. He held it out to Clara. She looked up at him. His eyes were pale gray, the color of creek ice before it breaks. "Can you stand?" he asked. Clara swallowed. Her throat worked twice before air came. "Yes." He offered no hand. He waited while she rose by herself. Only then did Gideon turn. The colt came out from under the wolf hide so fast, the nearest man dropped his pipe in the mud. The barrel stopped an inch from Silas Mercer's nose. Silas froze. His clean face lost its color in pieces. Gideon's voice rolled low enough to shake the glass in the bank door. "She belongs under my protection." No one moved. A dog under the boardwalk began to whine. Gideon cocked the hammer. The sound cut through the street like a nail driven into a coffin lid. "Any man crosses the mountain line after her," he said, "leaves his bones there." Silas lifted both hands slow. "You would draw on the law." Gideon stepped closer until the gun touched skin. "I draw on carrion." Clara stood in the mud with Mercer's red handprint rising on her cheek and her dead uncle's papers clutched to her chest. Gideon backed away, never lowering the gun. Then he turned toward the mountain road. "Come on!" Behind them, Obsidian Ridge held its breath, and Clara Vance, with nothing left but torn paper and a stranger's wrath, followed the monster into the snow. The climb to Skull Peak took the last color from Clara's hands. Snow blew sideways across the trail. It stuck in her lashes, worked into the torn seam of her coat, and melted cold against her neck. Gideon walked ahead, without looking back, one great shape under the wolf hide, breaking the drifts with his boots, so she could step where he had stepped. Once her knees folded. He stopped. Not a word. He waited with his back to the wind until she stood again. The cabin came out of the storm near dusk, low and crooked, against a wall of black pine. Smoke leaked from a stone chimney, thin as string. Beside it leaned a shed with one broken door and a corral half buried in snow. Gideon kicked the cabin door open. Inside smelled of old ash, wet hide iron, and meat gone near sour. A table sat under one small window. A cot stood against the wall. Traps hung from pegs. In the corner, a stack of papers had been stabbed through with a skinning knife to keep the wind from taking them. He tossed a blanket at Clara. It hit her chest. There. Then he threw a chunk of raw venison onto the table. It landed with a slap and left blood on the boards. "Fire's there. Knife's there. Don't touch the rifle." Clara held the blanket against herself. Gideon took a powder horn, a long gun, and a coil of rope from the wall. "You are leaving. Meet, don't walk inside by prayer. The storm is worsening." He looked at her then. The scar down his face pulled tight when his jaw shifted. "Storm don't care." He stepped out and shut the door. The cabin fell quiet. Clara stood in the dim light, waiting for tears that did not come. Her cheek still burned where Mercer had struck her. Mud had dried hard on her hem. Her ribs shook under the blanket, but her eyes stayed dry. A sound came from outside. Not wind. A low bawl. Clara crossed to the window. In the corral, 3 cattle stood with their heads hanging low. One lifted a front hoof, set it down, then lifted it again. Another had greenish rot packed deep between split claws. Steam rose from their backs and vanished in the snow. She stared at them. Then she turned to the papers pinned under the knife. Bills of sale. Feed tallies. Trap accounts. Banknotes. Marks made in a hand too heavy for a pen. Numbers scratched wrong. Debts counted twice. A trader named Bell had paid Gideon for 30 hides and charged him for 40 pounds of salt he had never bought. Clara pulled the knife free. The papers sprang loose. Her mouth flattened. "Thieves," she said to the empty room. By lantern light, she tore strips from her petticoat, found lye soap in a cracked crock, and boiled water in a black kettle. She cut away rot from the hooves with Gideon's skinning knife, packed them with pine tar, ash, and salt, then wrapped each hoof tight, while the animals leaned their great heads over her shoulder and breathed hot grass stink into her hair. The cold bit through her wet sleeves. Her fingers went stiff. She worked them open against the cattle's warm hides and kept going. When one calf would not rise, she shoved her shoulder beneath its neck and pushed until black spots swam before her eyes. The calf staggered up. Clara slapped its rump with a shaking hand. "Stand, you foolish thing." Back inside, she skinned the dried ice off the water bucket, cut the venison clean set stew to boil with onion ends and hard beans, and dragged the papers into piles. Honest debt, false debt, paid, stolen, unknown. By midnight, the cabin no longer looked like a den. It looked used. The fire burned steady. The stew thickened. Gideon's accounts lay in rows on the table, weighted with stones. Beside them sat a list written in Clara's small, hard script. What he was owed, what he had lost, what men had taken because he could not read their traps. The door opened near dawn. Gideon stumbled in with snow packed to his beard and blood dark on one sleeve. A dead buck hung over his shoulders. He took one step, then stopped. The buck slid from his back and hit the floor. His eyes moved from the fire to the table, from the table to the pot, from the pot to Clara, who stood with a bloody rag in one hand and his ruined ledgers in the other. Outside, a cow bawled strong from the corral. Gideon's hand closed on the doorframe until the wood gave a small crack. Clara lifted the top sheet. "They have been stealing from you for years." He did not answer. His gaze dropped to the rows of numbers he could not fight with fists. For the first time since she had met him, the mountain giant looked smaller than the room. By the third morning, Obsidian Ridge had shut its teeth. Gideon came down the north trail with mule hides and cracked antlers, and Bell barred his store door before Gideon reached the steps. No powder bell called through the glass. Gideon stood in the snow with the hides. "I got trade. Mayor's order." A curtain moved across the street. Then another. Faces showed and vanished. Gideon turned to the mercantile. The woman inside blew out the lamp. At the flour shed, a boy slid the bolt and would not raise his eyes. By noon, Gideon came back up Skull Peak empty-handed. Snow had crusted white over his beard. His sleeve had frozen stiff where the cut in his arm had opened again. Clara took the hides from him at the door. He did not let go. For a breath, they stood that way, both gripping dead weight. Then his fingers opened. "Mercer," she asked. Gideon crossed to the fire and set both hands near the flames. They shook once, then went still by force. He bought the valley twice, he said, once with paper, once with hunger. That night, Clara cut the last onion into 4 pieces, so thin each slice showed firelight through it. The stew was more water than meat. Gideon pushed his bowl toward her after 3 swallows. She pushed it back. The spoon rested between them. Neither touched it. Outside, the cattle stamped in the shed. The pine tar wrappings had held. They were living. That made another mouth to answer for. Clara went out before dawn with a grain sack and a hatchet. She dug under black roots where snow had hardened like river ice. She chipped bark from lodgepole pine, scraped the pale inner skin into a tin, and pulled Rose hips until her gloves tore. Back in the cabin, she ground bark with the butt of Gideon's pistol. Thump, turn, thump, turn. The powder smelled sharp and bitter, like green wood burnt too soon. She mixed it with melted snow and a fist of bean dust. It cooked into gray paste. Gideon looked at the skillet. "Dogs eat better down in town. Dogs do not keep ledgers." He huffed once. It might have been a laugh if it had not cut him on the way out. Days thinned. The buck bones were cracked and boiled clean. The coffee was gone. The salt was measured by grains and kept in a folded scrap of paper in Clara's bodice. Gideon hunted farther each time, walking out before light and coming back after dark, with his coat torn, his boots white to the knee and less in his hands. Once he came back with a rabbit no bigger than a man's fist. Once with nothing. The night after that, he laid 2 cartridges on the table. Clara looked at them. Only 2. He sat across from her, blood-dried black along his temple, and watched her thumb through her uncle's notebook. It was the one thing Mercer had not seen tucked behind the satchel lining. The pages were filled with crooked figures, broken words, and marks that looked near mad. Clara had burned willow charcoal to a point, and was writing between the lines. Not sums, a key. Every 5th number matched a deed book. Every false debt pointed at a water claim. Every misspelled name hid a bank share. Her lips moved without sound. Gideon's eyes did not leave her face. The fire sank lower. Wind pressed snow against the window until no glass showed. Clara turned one page, then stopped. There was Gideon's name. Not once. 9 times. Beside it, her uncle had drawn the mark of a spring, 3 slashes for Ridgeland, and one sentence so small she had to lean close. Thorn holds the first right if I am killed. The cabin creaked. Far down the mountain, a bell began to ring. Not church time. Not burial time. Warning. Gideon rose and opened the door. Black clouds rolled over the valley, swallowing the last strip of moon. The wind carried voices up the trail. Many voices. Clara closed the notebook with both hands, and the 2 cartridges on the table looked smaller than seeds. The bell kept ringing down in Obsidian Ridge. Gideon stood in the open doorway, one shoulder braced against the storm. Snow drove past him in white sheets. It hissed on the hearth when the wind forced it inside. Clara came up beside him with the notebook tucked under her arm. Below, through the black teeth of pine and rock, the town glowed wrong. Not lamps. Fire. A red bloom rose behind Mercer Bank, then another. Smoke bent flat under the gale. The storage house roof gave way with a dull thunder that climbed the mountain and rolled under Clara's feet. Gideon shut the door. Mercer's granary, he said. How do you know? Built it myself. Told him the south wall would fold under snow. He crossed to the rifle and checked the chamber. Empty. Then he picked up the Colt and opened the cylinder. 2 rounds. His thumb rested on them. Clara took one step toward the table. The notebook. No time. There is enough in here to hang him. Paper don't stop a mob. The wind struck the cabin so hard, ash lifted from the hearth and spun across the floor. Far-off voices rose again. Not one man. Many. Clara went to the window and scraped frost with her nail. Lights moved through the trees below. Torches. A crooked line of them. They wavered and vanished behind snow, then showed again closer. Gideon pulled a hatchet from the wall and slid his knife into his belt. Clara looked at the 2 cartridges. One for Mercer. One for the first fool through that door. And the other. He did not answer. She turned. He was already dragging a trunk across the floor toward the trap door near the ca. No. He kept moving. Gideon. He lifted the trap door. The cellar below breathed out cold earth and old potatoes. Get down! She clutched the notebook tighter. I am not crawling under the boards while they murder you. His hand closed around her wrist. Not rough. Not soft. Final. You can read. You can count. You know what he stole. His eyes held on hers, pale in the firelight. That makes you worth more than my hide. The first shot cracked outside. A hole punched through the shutter and spat splinters across the room. One nicked Gideon's cheek. A red line opened there, thin and bright. Clara's breath stopped in her chest. He did not blink. Another voice came from outside. Thorn. You hear us, Belle? Then Silas Mercer, smooth as warm grease over rotten meat. Men are starving because of you, Thorn. Come out and answer for what you hoarded. Gideon's lip pulled from his teeth. Clara saw then what waited behind the stories. Not a monster. A man who had learned to put his body where doors failed. More boots crunched in the snow. A torch struck the window and rolled off smoking. Gideon pushed the Colt into Clara's hand. It was heavy, cold, too large for her grip. Keep it cocked. No. He bent close. For the first time, the hard line of his mouth changed. Not much. Enough to break something open inside the room. Don't come up till the blood stops running. Before she could move, he lifted her by the waist and set her down on the cellar steps. The notebook slid from under her arm. She caught it against her chest. The trapdoor lowered over her head. Dark closed in. Above his boots crossed the boards. Slow. One step, then another. The cabin door groaned under the first blow. Clara crouched on the packed earth, Colt in one hand, notebook in the other, while dust fell into her hair from the ceiling cracks. A man shouted. The door shook again. Wood split. Through one narrow gap in the floorboards, she saw Gideon's boots plant wide before the threshold. The third blow tore the latch loose. Torchlight poured across the boards, and the mob came in. The men came in with rifles high and snow on their hats. Gideon took the first one by the coat and threw him against the wall hard enough to shake traps from their pegs. The second man raised a shotgun. The hammer clicked. Before it fell, a blow split the room from below. The cellar hatch burst upward. Clara came out through the broken boards with Gideon's splitting axe in one hand and the Colt in the other. Her hair had come loose. Soot marked one cheek. The notebook was shoved tight beneath her arm. She swung the axe once, not at flesh, at the rifle barrel nearest Gideon's chest. The stock cracked. The man holding it stumbled back, staring at his own broken gun as if it had betrayed him. Enough. Her voice did not rise. That made it worse. The room held still. Wind pushed through the busted door and drove torch smoke along the rafters. 30 men crowded the porch and yard beyond, their faces red with cold, their bellies pinched flat under coats. Silas Mercer stood behind them all, clean hat pulled low. Clara stepped over the broken hatch. Gideon turned toward her, one hand bleeding where a knife had grazed him. I told you stay down. You told me paper does not stop a mob. She walked past him. Silas smiled. Miss Vance. Still fond of crawling where you do not belong. Clara reached the doorway and lifted the Colt. Not at his head, at his rifle. Lower it. A few men shifted. Silas looked at them and laughed once. You going to let a mud-dragged clerk command you? Clara raised her uncle's notebook. My uncle kept 2 books. One for men like him. One for men like you. Silas's face held its shape. Only his eyes changed. Clara threw the first folded deed into the snow at his boots. Benjamin Vance did not die owing you. You owed him $3,000 in bank shares. Another paper. You forged his mark after he was dead. Another. You sold water you never owned. Bell the storekeeper bent and picked up the deed. He held it near a torch. His lips moved over the lines. Clara's fingers were black with charcoal, but they did not tremble. Read the seal. Bell swallowed. It is county seal. Silas stepped forward. That woman has been starving in a cabin with a savage. She is half mad. Clara turned the notebook toward the crowd. Then let madness count for you. She read the numbers. Slow, clear. The feed charges, the false hide weights, the banknotes made twice. The land claims shifted from dead hands into Mercer's vault. Men who could not read heard their own names, heard what they had paid, heard what had been taken. Muzzles lowered inch by inch. Then Clara reached the last page. Her thumb rested on one line. She looked back at Gideon. He stood just inside the door, huge and torn, blood on his hand, snow melting from his beard. He looked ready to be shot. He did not look ready to be named. Clara faced the town. Obsidian Ridge Spring. Skull Peak Ridge Land. South Basin Grazing Ground. Bank collateral on all water rights. She drew one breath. Held in trust by Elias Thorne. Passed by blood to Gideon Thorne. No one spoke. The wind sounded loud as a mill saw. Silas's mouth opened, but Clara did not give him air. My uncle wrote it plain. If he was killed, the truth was to go to the rightful heir. She held up the last page. Gideon Thorne owns the water beneath your feet. Bell lowered his torch. A rancher near the steps backed away from Silas. Another man turned his rifle. Then another. In the space of 10 breaths, the guns that had come for Gideon pointed at Mercer's chest. Silas looked from barrel to barrel. His gloved hand slid toward his coat. Gideon moved once. The room heard the Colt hammer lock under Clara's thumb. She kept the barrel steady on Silas Mercer. "Pull it," she said, "and every lie you ever told dies with you in the snow." Silas Mercer did not draw. His hand stopped halfway inside his coat, while every rifle in the yard found him. Bell stepped first. He took Mercer's pistol from under the black coat and threw it into the snow. Then he took the mayor's hat off his head. That small thing did more than a rope. It made Silas look like any other man caught stealing bread. "No," Silas said. His voice had lost its oil. A rancher seized one arm. The blacksmith took the other. Mercer kicked once, slipped in the snow, and went down hard. His fine coat dragged through the churned path where hungry men had climbed to kill Gideon. Gideon did not move. Clara came down the cabin steps with the notebook against her chest, and the Colt lowered at her side. The town backed away from her now. Not far, just enough to leave a path. They hauled Silas down the mountain before first light. No one sang. No one cheered. Only boots, ropes, hard breath, and the hiss of snow under torch stubs. When they reached Main Street, the sky had turned the color of cold tin. The mud hole before Mercer Bank was still there, rimmed with ice. Clara knew its shape before she saw it. Her torn ribbon lay frozen near the boardwalk, half buried in gray slush. The men stopped. Nobody asked. The blacksmith shoved Silas forward. Mercer fell on both knees in the mud where Clara had fallen. Brown water climbed over his cuffs. His palms slapped down. His clean gloves vanished under the muck. A woman on the boardwalk looked at Clara, then looked away. Silas lifted his head. Mud ran from his chin. "You need me," he said. "This town needs order." Clara stepped close enough for him to see the red mark his hand had left on her cheek, faded but not gone. "No," she said. "It needs terms." By noon, the bank doors stood open. Mercer's ledgers lay across his own desk. Clara sat behind it with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, reading names while the town lined up in silence. Gideon stood at the door. No gun in hand. He did not need one. "Water rights stay with Thorne," Clara said. "Land leases may be granted for winter survival. No man draws from the spring without labor owed and counted." Bell swallowed. "How much labor?" Clara dipped the pen. "Enough to rebuild the granary right." She looked at the blacksmith. "Enough to cut firewood for widows. At the ranchers. Enough to haul feed up Skull Peak till every beast there stands sound. At the women who had watched her crawl. Enough to copy every claim in open book so no man can hide behind ink again." No one argued. The pen scratched. Names went down. Debts changed shape. Not forgiven. Not forgotten. Made useful. Outside, Silas sat tied to the hitching rail, with mud drying on his coat, waiting for the circuit judge. Children stared at him and did not laugh. By sundown, the first wagon of flour went up Skull Peak. Then salt. Then powder. Then oats. Men bent their backs under loads they had once denied him. Gideon watched from the ridge above the cabin as the line climbed slow through blue evening snow. Clara stood beside him, wrapped in the wolf hide. The valley below lay dark and wide with lamp glow scattered like coals. The spring creek cut a black line through the basin. His land. Their land, if he would say the word. Gideon's arm came around her waist, careful at first, then sure. His chin lowered to her hair. "You could go east," he said. Clara looked down at Obsidian Ridge, at the bank, the mud, the road that had brought her to her knees, and the mountain that had given her back her name. She put her hand over his. "I have no family left," she said. Gideon's arm tightened. Clara turned her face into his coat and let the words come warm against the wolf hide. "Because all my world is standing right here."